Break out the pumpkins and clean off your costumes, everyone, for the spooky season is here again. And like last year, we're going to be doing Halloween-based content for the season. And we're just in time for the release of a sequel to a rather well-known spooky time favorite, with Hocus Pocus 2 that just came out on Disney+. No spoilers here, but I thought it was a decent movie, though it had a few flaws that brought it down just a little bit. And it was while watching the film that I couldn't help but look back at the original and wonder why, after all these years, I still recalled it fondly. So with that said, let's take a short trip to Salem, Oregon and find out why people enjoyed the heck out of the Sanderson Sisters in the original Hocus Pocus. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am your ever-friendly Pokeprof, and welcome back to Fascinating Fiction. So I'm going to be entirely honest to start things off here. Hocus Pocus is an early, low-budget, live-action 90s film. And this isn't to try to insult the movie or anything, but that was kind of the thing for Disney to do back in the day when it came to anything not animated. While masterpieces like Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin were taking center stage in just how great these movies could be, Disney was also producing things like A Kid in King Arthur's Court and Blank Check. Not exactly horrible films, but ones that really didn't go heavy into the special effects like what we see with Marvel and the live-action reboots that we get today. Which isn't to say that films need special effects to be popular or anything, but it basically came down to living through syndication on sites like the Disney Channel for movies like this to really take off. And that's kind of what Hocus Pocus did. Despite being a complete and total flop at the box office, to the tune of losing the House of Mouse about $16 million, by being rerun just about every Halloween since its release on TV, gave it a lot of staying power and eventually became a fan favorite. Getting to the actual movie itself, we're introduced right away to the major antagonist of the film, the Sanderson Sisters, who are done in the style of the more medieval witch. You know, the whole evil lady in the forest kind of thing. Especially in the 90s, this was kind of a popular way to portray magic and spellcasters in general, being a good 3 years before The Boy Who Lived would make an appearance. Being portrayed as old crones initially, Sarah, Mary, and Winifred Sanderson, played by Sarah Jessica Parker, Kathy Najimy, and Bette Midler, lure a young girl known as Emily Binks to their cabin in the woods with the intent of sucking out her soul to give them their youth back. Now, I'm actually going to take a moment here to point out what's probably the greatest strength of this entire movie, and that's the fact that it actually takes time to establish itself for further events in the film. Something that even modern movies tend to forget sometimes. Take a look at the introduction to our witches here, and their unique attributes for what I'm talking about. Sarah's voice, Mary's nose, and Winifred's intelligence and power. Not only will we see all of these aspects come into play throughout the film, it also serves as a subtle reason for why the characters work together like they do. It shows off that despite Winifred holding the most power out of the three, she wouldn't be half as dangerous without Mary's nose to sniff out the children, or Sarah's voice to lure them in. Of course, they're not the only ones who hold interest to us at this point of the movie, as we have Thackeray Binks, Emily's older brother. He tries to free his sister while she's captured, but fails, ending up being turned into an immortal cat by the witches so that he may forever live with his guilt. What's probably his most interesting aspect is the fact that he's actually played by two actors in the film. One for his human appearance, who is played by Sean Murray, and one for his voice, played by Jason Marsden. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that Marsden actually played the role of another character that we have had here on Fascinating Fiction before. That of Haku, the river spirit in Spirited Away. So what? That makes about the third time I've had an episode close together that had the same actors in it? From what I could find, though, and take this with a grain of salt, the reason Marsden was actually called to play Thackeray was because Murray couldn't give a realistic English accent for the film. Oh, and for any of you Disney fans who are wondering why Binks here sounds so familiar in his cat form, he's also the main voice for Max Goof in pretty much anything that the character has been in outside of the original Goof Troop itself. Regardless, after we get out of the history lesson being told to high school students, we get introduced to our main protagonist, Max Dennison, played by Omri Katz. He's pretty much there to fulfill the trope of being a fish out of water, a California kid who got moved to Salem and simply hates being there. We do get to see the fact that the kid has rather big brass ones when he goes up and gives his crush and other main character Allison his phone number in front of the entire class. After a small run-in with a pair of bullies, Jay and Ernie, who will continue to be a thorn in our characters' sides throughout the film, we get introduced to Danny, Max's little sister and the final main character of the bunch. And this is actually where one of the major elements of the film really comes into play. While the focus of Hocus Pocus is indeed on a spooky Halloween tale, one that has a bit more of a threatening edge to it that you would not normally see within the Disney stock, the other strongest element is actually the relationship between Max and Danny. Being only 8, Danny is fairly childish and doesn't understand why her brother, who's now 15, isn't enjoying the holidays like he used to, or is the same fun-loving person he used to be. She even points out, rightfully so, after a fight between the two, that Max has to get used to living in Salem as that's their new home, and there's not much more he can do about it. It's this element of the two being conflicting but caring siblings that actually carry a lot of the film's plot later on. Not to mention, being 8, Danny here has some of the best lines in the entire film, especially as they meet up with Allison.
What do you call him, Max? Yabos? Max likes her yabos. In fact, he loves them.
Seriously, I've gotta ask, outside of this film, have breasts ever been referred to as yabos by anyone? Regardless, in an attempt to impress Allison and not believing in any of the stories the villagers have told about the sisters, Max lights the black flame candle and, being a virgin, brings back the witches from the dead. And yes, the jokes are quite real, folks. This movie pokes fun at the fact that Max is a virgin several times in this film. Despite the fact that with his age and the cast in general, not only are they all virgins, but there's nothing really wrong with that. I chalk it up to being more about something to do with the old-timey magic being more related to quote-unquote purity of one's soul, whatever that means. Either way, his actions bring Winifred and her sisters back, and this is where the real beast of the film comes in, with that being 3 90s kids against 3 witches from 300 years ago, and explores how our 3 villainesses adapt to the modern world. Say that 3 times fast. And that was, and kinda still is, quite a twist to the normal formula that we would see when it comes to this kind of movie. In so many other films that have time-displaced characters, they're usually the good guys. Hell, Disney released Under Wraps about 4 years after this movie, all about an Egyptian mummy who's awake and aware within the 20th century. The idea itself isn't new, but using it for the villain is something that's still not commonly seen. What's actually quite interesting is that as the witches get more and more exposed to the then current year of 1993, they are able to adapt more and more, picking up on some lingo as well as being able to turn the situation to their advantage a few times. This in particular is shown off in one of the most famous scenes in the entire movie, the musical number I Put a Spell on You. You see, by this point in the film, the sisters have been exposed to enough of the modern era to realize that things have changed, with stuff like All Hallows Eve becoming the holiday it is today, and have constantly been the butt of jokes thanks to their lack of knowledge of how the world works. It's with them entering the town hall though that Winifred takes a moment to watch the band on stage, noting how they're singing a variation of Screaming Jay Hawkins' original Spell on You song. It's because of Winnie's intelligence here that allows the witches to trick the adults, using their own weird dress to pass off as simply women in costume, and then singing their own variation of the song to enchant the parents of Salem. And speaking of the song itself, I've actually got to mention something about it and why it's so catchy. The original Hawking song is actually a bit more of a corrupted love song, where the singer is a man who's in love with someone who doesn't return those affections, using the song itself to lay claim on that lover.
I don't care if you don't want me, I'm yours!
The song itself is actually surprisingly light on lyrics, relying mostly on the background music being methodical and constant, to give it an almost stalkerish vibe. Not only does Midler's version of the song have a much more bombastic feel to it, but they completely changed the lyrics of the song itself outside of the cast a spell on you and now you're mine bit. It completely transforms the song, making it stand out from the original. That, and it's just a frickin' bop. But getting off our villains for a bit, while they are fantastic and pretty much the main reason to watch the entire film, I do want to make special mention about just how intelligent our main characters are in dealing with the witches and how that's a rarity to see, especially in something that's aimed at kids. Between using a lighter to set off sprinklers, a car's headlights covered in a colored plastic wrap to mimic the sunrise, and using a school's pottery kiln to roast the witches alive, our main cast are more than capable of taking care of themselves. It also helps that Thackeray is able to use his own knowledge of magic and the inability to die to his advantage, as it's because of him that they know that the graveyard is considered to be hallowed ground. The end of the film itself is also pretty interesting, considering the fact that it actually wraps up a lot of the plot elements pretty neatly. Though I'm not going to be covering too much of it here, mostly because I think it's an enjoyable enough movie that I would want you to go see it for yourselves if you haven't already. It's really the final stinger of the film that most people would notice, where we get to see the magic book's eye open that would be our hint to a possible sequel. Though as you all well know by now, we didn't get that for almost 3 decades. But that's actually only as far as the movie is concerned. Did you know that there is actually a written sequel for Hocus Pocus before the second movie ever came out? The book, Hocus Pocus and the all-new sequel, was written back in 2018, retelling the original movie through words, as well as having a follow-up story that takes place 25 years after the film, starring Max and Allison's daughter Poppy, who ends up bringing the witches back in an effort to prove her parents' stories about them wrong. I couldn't tell you how good or bad the book itself is, having never read it myself, but from what I've heard, it actually includes elements from the original script of the film that never made it into the movie. Speaking of that, let's actually touch on some of the things that were lost from script to film, since there's quite a bit that could have changed the movie entirely. We've got story elements like how, originally, Winnie's magic book was supposed to be a gift from the devil himself. The fact that Thackeray isn't immortal but has 9 million lives, and by the time we actually meet him in the movie he's gone through about 300 of them. And the fact that there was a good witch named Elizabeth Podbury, who turned out to be Allison's ancestor. What's more, in that novelization I talked about with the sequel, Elizabeth pops up in there too. And do you want to know what her full name is? Elizabeth Sanderson Podbury. Yeah, that's a thing. She's the White Witch of the Sanderson Sisters. What's perhaps the most interesting thing about the script is how it actually got started. As the producer of the film, David Kirshner stated that he came up with the idea after his neighbor's black cat strayed into his yard, the man telling his young daughter a story about how he was once a boy who had been cursed by 3 witches. Wait a minute, why does that producer's name sound familiar? Oh, hell's bells, really? I chose another movie that this guy was a part of? Okay, mental note after today. I'm going to take a small look over everything Kirshner's ever been a part of and make sure we don't talk about him again for like half a year or so. Regardless, Hocus Pocus is a fan favorite movie because of its comedic characters, catchy musical number, and the fact that while it's not the most well-developed thing out there, it's actually told a pretty decent story that had a lot more subtlety than one would think. It lived on for this long and produced a sequel on the pure power of Halloween, and it will continue to live on for years to come. With all that said, I hope I've done a good job to entertain you, and I'll do my best to do so again in the future. Hopefully you'll follow along with my content by subscribing and doing all the other things that gives us YouTubers life. If you wish to support me a bit more, I do have a Patreon where you can get access to bonus content. But until next time, stay frosty.